The stars were dying. Admiral Zeftai pressed his crystalline hand against the viewport of his flagship, watching another star system blink out of existence. Where moments before had been the bright glow of the Kepler 442 system, now only darkness remained. The void swarm had consumed another world, another billion lives, another piece of the galaxy that would never shine again. "How many does that make?" he asked his tactical officer, though he already knew the answer would bring no comfort. 1,473 systems, Admiral," came the reply from Lieutenant Kesserel, her voice carrying the weight of despair that had become common among the Nexari fleet. In the past 6 months alone, Zeftai's species, the Nexari, were beings of living crystal. Their bodies caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns, and their ships were crafted from the same crystalline materials that made up their forms. For over 10,000 years, they had been one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Their technology was elegant, efficient, and had helped bring peace to countless worlds, but elegance meant nothing against the void swarm. The enemy had appeared from dark space 3 years ago, emerging from gaps between dimensions that should not have existed. They were creatures of nightmare, living ships that grew and adapted, biomechanical horrors that fed on the life force of entire planets. Their technology was not built, but grown. Their ships were not piloted, but were themselves alive, hungry, and utterly alien. "Sir, incoming transmission from the Luminal High Command," his communications officer announced. The holographic display shimmered to life, revealing the ethereal form of High Luminal Velthar. The Luminals were beings of pure energy, their bodies, shifting patterns of light and electricity. They had been the galaxy's greatest source of power technology for millennia, their energy manipulation abilities unmatched by any other species. "Admiral Zeftai," Velthar's voice resonated through the bridge, carrying harmonics that most species found soothing. But today, even the Luminal's natural calm could not hide the strain. "Our defensive line at the Sigma Draconis cluster has fallen. We lost 47 energy cruisers and the 9th Luminal fleet is gone, completely absorbed." Zeftai felt his crystal structure dim with grief. The 9th fleet had been composed of 15,000 Luminal warriors, each one capable of channeling enough energy to power a small planet. If they had been absorbed by the swarm, it meant the enemy was growing stronger. "What about the Kethvar?" he asked. "Are their hive fleet still holding the inner rim?" "Barely," Velthar replied. "But Hive Queen Zakth reports that the swarm is learning to disrupt their mental connections. They're starting to hunt the queen specifically. If they lose their hive mind coordination..." Zeftai didn't need the sentence finished. The Kethvar were insectoid beings that operated through a collective consciousness. Individual Kethvar were relatively weak, but when connected through their queens, they could coordinate fleet movements across vast distances with perfect precision. Their ships moved like schools of fish, anticipating each other's actions in battle. But if the queens were being targeted, that coordination would collapse. "How long do we have?" Zeftai asked the question that haunted every military leader in the galaxy. "Our combined analysis suggests 6 months before the swarm reaches the core worlds." Velthar's form flickered with distress. 8 months before they reach Earth's sector, though the humans probably don't even know what's coming. Zeftai had heard of humans, of course. They were a young species from a small world on the galactic rim. The last survey reports had classified them as a Level 2 civilization. They had achieved interstellar travel but were still using primitive fusion drives and kinetic weapons. Most galactic species reached Level 5 or 6 before being considered for contact. Humans were at least 1,000 years away from that milestone. "The humans," Zeftai mused. "Do we have any current intelligence on them?" His intelligence officer, a young Nexari named Quilvin, pulled up the relevant files. "Last report was filed 18 months ago, sir. They've established colonies on 12 worlds in their local cluster. Their technology appears to be advancing rapidly, but it's still very crude. They use chemical explosives for weapons, metal projectiles instead of energy beams, and their ships are built like flying fortresses rather than elegant vessels." "Fortresses?" Zeftai found that interesting. Most advanced species built their ships for speed and efficiency. Why would anyone build a fortress in space? Yes, sir. Very thick armor, multiple redundant systems, and weapons that seem designed more for causing massive destruction rather than precise tactical strikes. Our xenobiologists believe it's because they evolved as persistence hunters. They're naturally aggressive and seem to solve most problems by hitting them harder rather than finding elegant solutions. Felthar's energy form pulsed with what might have been amusement. Primitive but perhaps admirable in its own way, though I doubt their projectile weapons would be effective against swarm bioarmor. Zeftai was about to respond when alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Red lights flashed in warning patterns as his sensor officer called out urgent readings. Admiral, massive hyperspace distortions detected. The swarm is coming out of dark space, coordinate 74 Mark 9. How many ships? Zeftai was already moving toward his command chair, his crystalline form catching the emergency lighting in. Sharp rainbow patterns. Sir, the sensors can't get an exact count. There are thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. The main display shifted to show the tactical situation. What Zeftai saw made his light dim to almost nothing. The void swarm was emerging from hyperspace in a formation that stretched across 3 star systems. Their ships were nightmarish things, organic curves mixed with mechanical components, hulls that pulsed like living tissue, and weapons that looked like they had been grown rather than built. At the center of the formation was something that defied easy description. It was massive, easily the size of a small moon, and it seemed to bend light around itself. The ship, if it could be called a ship, was the darkest thing Zeftai had ever seen, as if it absorbed not just light, but hope itself. The Devourer, he whispered. It was the swarm's command vessel, the thing that had led the destruction of hundreds of worlds. Intelligence reports suggested it was not just a ship, but a living entity of immense power and malevolence. Sir, incoming transmission from all coalition fleets, his communications officer reported. Emergency coordination protocol is active. All ships are to converge on the Nexus gate system for final defense. Zeftai felt the weight of the moment. The Nexus gate system was home to 12 billion souls across 4 inhabited worlds. It was also the location of the galaxy's most important hyperspace junction. If the swarm took it, they could reach any system in the galaxy within days instead of months. Signal all Nexari fleets, he commanded. Full speed to Nexus gate, and send a transmission to every species in the galaxy. Every world, every colony, every listening post. This is not just about the coalition anymore. This is about survival. As his ship's crystalline engines powered up to maximum, Zeftai looked out at the approaching darkness. Somewhere out there, beyond the galactic rim, humans were going about their daily lives completely unaware that their galaxy was dying. He envied them their ignorance. The next few hours passed in a blur of hyperspace jumps and desperate coordination. Ships from across the galaxy converged on the Nexus gate system. Nexari crystal dreadnoughts, luminal energy cruisers, Kethvar, hive ships and vessels from dozens of smaller species. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history, but it still might not be enough. Fleet status report, Zeftai ordered as they dropped out of hyperspace near Nexus Gate Prime. 2,300,000 ships present, sir, came the reply. Nexari 4th through 9th fleets, Luminal High Command Battle Group, Kethvar Hive Clusters 7 through 15, and various support fleets from our allies. It sounded impressive until you considered what they faced. Intelligence estimates put the swarm's numbers at over 10 million vessels, and unlike coalition ships, swarm vessels could repair and reproduce themselves during battle. Sir, his sensor officer called out, voice tight with worry. The swarm has entered the outer system. They'll be here in 4 hours. Zeftai nodded grimly. 4 hours to prepare for what might be the last battle in galactic history. Around him, his bridge crew worked with the quiet efficiency of professional soldiers, but he could see the fear in their crystalline faces. They all knew the odds. Admiral, his communications officer spoke up again. The galaxy-wide distress signal has been sent. Every species with radio capability will receive it within the next 6 hours. Good, Zeftai replied, though he knew it was probably futile. What could the primitive species on the rim do against an enemy that had brought the galaxy's greatest civilizations to their knees? Still, he thought of those humans with their crude weapons and fortress-like ships. There was something about them that intrigued him, though he couldn't say what. Perhaps it was simply that they were one of the few species that had never known the kind of peace the galaxy had enjoyed for millennia. They had grown up fighting, against their environment, against each other, against every challenge their harsh world had thrown at them. Maybe that experience would serve them well in what was coming. But that was a thought for another time. Right now he had a battle to prepare for, and a galaxy to try to save. All ships, he broadcast on the fleet-wide channel. This is Admiral Zeftai of the Nexari High Command. Today we make our stand. Today we show the darkness that some lights cannot be extinguished. For the galaxy. For our families. For every world that still dreams of tomorrow. The response came back from 2 million ships in 100 different languages, but the meaning was the same. They would fight. They would hold the line as long as possible, even if it meant they would all die trying. As the swarm's dark ships appeared on the edge of sensor range, Zeftai allowed himself one last thought about the humans on their distant worlds. He hoped they would remember the civilizations that had fought and died to give them a chance at survival. He hoped they would do better than the rest of the galaxy had. The battle for everything was about to begin. The first wave hit the coalition fleet like a living tsunami. Admiral Zeftai watched from his flagship's bridge as 10,000 swarm vessels emerged from the darkness, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with malevolent life. These were not the elegant ships of galactic civilization, built with careful attention to form and function. These were predators, grown in the void between stars, shaped by hunger and an alien intelligence that viewed all other life as food. All ships, defensive formation Nexus 7, he commanded, his crystalline voice carrying across the fleet communications. Fire at will. The response was immediate and spectacular. 2 million coalition ships opened fire simultaneously, filling space with brilliant streams of energy. Nexari crystal cannons sent focused beams of coherent light that could cut through the hull of a planet. Luminal vessels discharged massive electrical arcs that could fry the electronics of entire fleets. Keth Warships launched swarms of guided projectiles that moved with the precision of their hive mind coordination. For a moment, Zeftai allowed himself to hope. The combined firepower of the galaxy's greatest civilizations was truly impressive. Swarm ships began to break apart under the assault, their organic hulls splitting open to vent atmosphere and biofluids into space. But then the enemy began to adapt. "Sir," his tactical officer called out, voice tight with disbelief. "The swarm ships they're changing. The damaged vessels are regenerating, and the intact ones are modifying their hull composition." Zeftai watched in horror as the truth became clear. Where Nexari energy beams had carved deep gouges in swarm hulls, new armor was growing. Armor that reflected and dispersed the crystal weapon's precise frequencies. Where luminol electrical attacks had burned through biomechanical systems, new insulation was forming. Thick organic barriers that absorbed the energy attacks harmlessly. "They're learning from our weapons," he whispered, in real time. This was what made the swarm so terrifying. They were not just alien. They were actively hostile to the very concept of other forms of life. Every defense the coalition used became useless within minutes as the enemy adapted. Every tactic became known, every strategy anticipated. "Sir, urgent transmission from the luminal flagship," his communications officer announced. High luminal Velthar's energy form appeared on the holographic display, but something was wrong. The usual bright coherence of his being was flickering, dimming at the edges like a candle in the wind. "Admiral," Velthar's voice carried harmonics of pain and fear. "The swarm has deployed something new. They're draining us. The energy beings among my crew are being pulled apart, absorbed into their ships." Zeftai felt his crystal structure grow cold. The luminals were beings of pure energy. They had no physical bodies to destroy, no organs to damage. They should have been immune to most forms of attack. If the swarm could absorb them— "How many have you lost?" he asked. 3,000 in the past 10 minutes, Velthar replied, his form flickering more violently. "And it's accelerating. I don't think we can maintain formation much longer." Before Zeftai could respond, new alarms began sounding throughout his ship. His sensor officer was calling out readings in a voice that cracked with panic. "Admiral, massive energy signature approaching from the swarm formation. It's the Devourer." The main tactical display shifted to show the approaching nightmare. The Devourer was even more terrifying up close than intelligence reports had suggested. It was not just large, it was impossible. The thing defied every law of physics Zeftai understood. Its hull seemed to be made of solid darkness, matter, so dense that light could not escape from its surface. Around it, space itself seemed to bend and twist, as if reality was breaking down in the presence of something that should not exist. "All ships concentrate fire on the Devourer," Zeftai ordered, though he suspected it would be useless. He was right. Every weapon in the Coalition fleet turned toward the approaching monstrosity. Enough energy to destroy a small star system poured into the concentrated attack. The space around the Devourer lit up like a miniature galaxy as millions of weapons struck its hull simultaneously. The attacks simply vanished. Not reflected, not absorbed. They simply ceased to exist the moment they touched the Devourer's hull, as if the laws that governed energy and matter meant nothing to this thing. "Sir," his tactical officer whispered, "it's not just immune to our weapons, it's feeding on them. Every attack we make is making it stronger." Zeftai felt something he had never experienced before in his long military career: true despair. How do you fight something that becomes more powerful every time you attack it? How do you defeat an enemy that learns from your every move and grows stronger from your every effort? "Incoming transmission from Hive Queen Zakth," his communications officer announced. The insectoid face of the Kethvar Queen appeared on screen, her compound eyes reflecting the fear that all Coalition forces now felt. "Admiral Zeftai," she clicked in the rapid-fire language of her species. "My hive reports that the swarm is targeting our queen specifically. They have some kind of psychic weapon. My sisters are going silent one by one. If we lose the hive connection—" She didn't need to finish. Without their hive-mind coordination, the Kethvar fleets would become vulnerable individual ships instead of the perfectly synchronized force they were known for. "How long can you maintain coordination?" Zeftai asked. "Maybe an hour," Zakth replied. "Less if they concentrate their efforts." An hour. Zeftai looked at the tactical display, where Coalition ships were falling by the hundreds as the swarm pressed their attack. They had started this battle with over 2 million vessels. In the past 30 minutes, they had lost nearly 300,000. At this rate, the fleet would be destroyed in less than 6 hours, and then the swarm would be free to consume the 12 billion souls living on the worlds of the Nexus gate system. "Sir," his communications officer spoke up again, "the galaxy-wide distress signal has been acknowledged by several species on the Outer Rim. The Tauri Federation, the Hegemony of Brass, the Human Colonial Authority, and a few others. They're asking what assistance they can provide." Under other circumstances, Zeftai might have found that amusing. What could primitive species with barely functional interstellar capability do against an enemy that was destroying the galaxy's most advanced civilizations? But right now, he was too tired and too desperate to be amused by anything. "Send them tactical data," he ordered. "Tell them to stay away from the core systems and to prepare for the worst." "Sir, specific message from the Human Colonial Authority. Admiral Sarah Chen sends her regards and says that the human fleet is en route." "The human fleet?" Zeftai was confused. According to the last intelligence reports, humans had perhaps a dozen ships capable of interstellar travel. What could they possibly contribute to a battle involving millions of vessels? "Yes, sir. She says estimated arrival time is—" The communications officer paused, checking the data. 18 minutes. 18 minutes. Zeftai almost laughed. Even if the humans had 100 ships, they would arrive just in time to watch the Coalition's final defeat. Still, he had to admire their courage. Most species were smart enough to run when faced with certain death. A massive explosion lit up the main display as another Nexari dreadnought succumbed to swarm bioplasma weapons. The beautiful crystalline ship, which had taken decades to grow and had served for centuries, broke apart in a shower of rainbow fragments that sparkled once before going dark forever. "Sir, the Luminal High Command reports they're pulling back," his tactical officer announced. "They've lost over half their energy beings to swarm absorption weapons." "And the Kethvar?" Hive Queen Zacht reports that 4 of her sister queens have gone silent. Fleet coordination is down to 60% efficiency and falling. Zeftai closed his crystalline eyes and tried to think. There had to be something, some tactic or strategy that could turn the tide. But the swarm had an answer. For everything. They adapted to every weapon, countered every formation, and grew stronger with every passing minute. "Admiral," his sensor officer called out, "I'm detecting a hyperspace emergence on the edge of the system. It's not a swarm signature." Zeftai opened his eyes and looked at the tactical display. A small icon had appeared at the very edge of sensor range, something coming out of hyperspace. The energy signature was unlike anything in the Coalition database. "Analysis?" he asked. "Unknown, sir. The hyperspace exit was violent, very crude compared to our quantum tunnel technology. Whatever it is, it's big, but I can only detect one contact. One ship. Whatever species had sent aid, they had sent a single vessel against a swarm fleet of millions." "Can you get visual confirmation?" Zeftai asked. "Working on it, sir. The exit generated a lot of electromagnetic interference, but it's clearing up. I should have imaging in now." The main display shifted to show the edge of the system, where space was still rippling from the violent hyperspace exit. As the interference cleared, a shape began to resolve itself against the starfield. Zeftai stared at what appeared on screen and felt his crystalline structure resonate with confusion. The ship, if it could be called a ship, was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was massive, easily 2 kilometers long, but it looked like it had been built by someone who had no understanding of proper engineering principles. The hull was thick beyond any reasonable requirement, covered in what looked like crude armor plating welded on in overlapping sections. Weapons bristled from every surface, not the elegant energy projectors favored by advanced civilizations, but massive kinetic cannons and what appeared to be missile launchers. The whole thing looked less like a starship and more like a flying eye. Fortress built by primitives who solved every problem with more armor and bigger guns. "Sir," his communications officer said quietly, "it's human." Of course it was. Zeftai found himself staring at humanity's idea of a warship, and it was exactly what he might have expected from a species that still used projectile weapons and chemical explosives. The ship looked like it had been designed by someone whose solution to every engineering challenge was to make it bigger, heavier, and more heavily armed. "Sir, the human ship is broadcasting," his communications officer announced. "Put it through," Zeftai ordered, curious to hear what the primitive humans had to say. A human face appeared on the communications display. A woman with short brown hair and eyes that held a hardness Zeftai recognized from veteran soldiers. She wore a uniform that looked functional rather than decorative, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that surprised him. "Coalition forces, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the human colonial navy ship Indomitable. We received your distress call. What's the tactical situation?" Zeftai almost didn't know how to respond. How do you explain to a primitive species that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations were being systematically destroyed by an enemy they couldn't even hurt? "Admiral Chen," he replied formally, "I am Admiral Zeftai of the Nexari High Command. The situation is critical. We face an enemy that adapts to our weapons and feeds on our attacks. We have lost hundreds of thousands of ships and the battle appears to be lost." The human admiral's expression didn't change. "Understood. What are your enemy's capabilities and numbers?" "Approximately 10 million vessels, with adaptive biomechanical technology that becomes immune to any weapon used against it more than once. Their command vessel appears to be immune to all known forms of attack. Admiral Chen nodded as if this was routine information. Copy that. Any friendly casualties from kinetic weapons? Zeftai was confused by the question. Kinetic weapons? No, we don't use such primitive. Why do you ask? For the first time since the conversation began, Admiral Chen smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Because we do, she said simply. And that was when space exploded around the human ship. Zeftai watched in amazement as the Indomitable opened fire with weapons he had thought were obsolete. Massive railguns launched projectiles at relativistic speeds, while missile launchers spat out hundreds of warheads in coordinated patterns. The ship wasn't just attacking, it was charging, accelerating directly toward the center of the swarm formation with what could only be described as suicidal aggression. Is she insane? His tactical officer whispered. But as Zeftai watched the primitive human vessel plow into the enemy formation, he began to understand something that chilled and amazed him in equal measure. The swarm couldn't adapt to kinetic weapons. They were trying. He could see biomechanical hulls attempting to grow armor designed to stop solid projectiles. But you can't deflect a tungsten rod moving at 10% of light speed. You can't adapt to the fundamental physics of mass and velocity. And apparently, you can't predict the tactics of a species crazy enough to ram enemy dreadnoughts with their own ship. Sir, his communications officer said in a voice filled with wonder, the humans are requesting tactical coordination. Admiral Chen wants to know if we can provide targeting data for the swarm command vessel. Zeftai stared at the tactical display, where a single human ship was carving through the enemy formation like an ancient warrior with a primitive sword, leaving destruction in its wake. Maybe, just maybe, the galaxy had found its savior. In the most unlikely place possible. The hyperspace rift that tore open above the battlefield was an abomination. Every sensor operator in the Coalition fleet felt their instruments scream warnings as reality twisted in ways that should not have been possible. Nexari quantum sensors, calibrated to detect the elegant mathematics of their species' dimensional travel, registered readings that made no sense. Luminal energy detectors, designed to measure the clean transitions of their light speed jumps, showed patterns that violated every known law of physics. Commander Quilvin, working the sensor station aboard Admiral Zeftai's flagship, stared at his readouts in confusion and growing alarm. Sir, he called out, his crystalline voice carrying harmonics of distress. The hyperspace emergence is wrong. Everything about it is wrong. Zeftai moved to look over his subordinate's shoulder. What he saw on the displays made his own crystal structure dim with concern. Where a proper hyperspace exit should show clean mathematical curves as the ship transitioned from higher dimensions back to normal space, this emergence looked like someone had taken a crude tool and simply ripped a hole in the fabric of reality. Analysis? The Admiral requested. Sir, whoever is coming through is using some kind of brute force approach to dimensional travel. Instead of finding the natural weak points in space-time and gently opening a quantum tunnel, they appear to be tearing through by main force. The energy expenditure is enormous, and the side effects? Quilvin's voice trailed off as new readings appeared on his screens. What side effects? Zeftai demanded. Sir, they're destabilizing the local space-time continuum. The gravitational waves alone should have torn their ship apart. And the exotic matter discharge is off the charts. This level of dimensional disturbance should be impossible to survive. Across the fleet, similar conversations were taking place as sensor operators tried to make sense of what they were seeing. On the luminal flagship, High Admiral Velthar watched his energy sensors register readings that seemed to defy everything his people knew about dimensional physics. The emergence is violent beyond comprehension, he reported to his tactical staff, his energy form flickering with confusion. Whatever species designed this method of travel has either mastered forces we cannot understand, or they are completely insane. On the Kethvar hive ships, the collective consciousness of Queen Zakth processed the sensor data through thousands of linked minds simultaneously. The conclusion reached by the hive was unanimous and disturbing. This was not the work of any known galactic civilization. The dimensional signature is Crude, she reported across the quantum link to her sister queens. Primitive, but somehow effective. They are achieving dimensional travel through methods that should destroy any vessel attempting them. As the rift continued to expand, every ship in the Coalition fleet found their attention divided between the approaching swarm and this new unknown. The tear in space-time was massive now, easily large enough to accommodate ships the size of Coalition dreadnoughts. But what was coming through? "Sir," Quilvin called out again, his voice tight with disbelief. "I'm getting mass readings. Whatever is coming through, it's big, very big." "How big?" Zeftai asked, though he was beginning to suspect he wouldn't like the answer. 2 kilometers, sir. Maybe more. And the mass distribution is unusual. Instead of the efficient design we'd expect from an advanced civilization, this thing reads like a solid block of metal with engines attached. Zeftai felt a chill run through his crystalline matrix. 2 kilometers was larger than most Coalition capital ships, and those were marvels of engineering. Elegant structures that maximized capability while minimizing mass. A ship that read as a solid block of metal suggested construction methods that were wasteful beyond belief. Unless efficiency wasn't the point. Unless whoever built it cared more about durability than elegance. The rift reached maximum expansion, and something began to emerge. What came through the tear in spacetime defied every assumption about starship design that galactic civilization held. It was indeed massive. 2 full kilometers of brutal angular construction that looked like it had been built by someone who solved every engineering problem by adding more armor and bigger weapons. The hull was thick beyond any reasonable requirement, covered in overlapping plates of what appeared to be crude metal alloy welded together in sections. There was no elegant curve work, no consideration for aesthetic appeal, no apparent attempt to minimize mass or maximize efficiency. It was a fortress that someone had somehow convinced to fly. Weapons bristled from every available surface. Not the sleek energy projectors favored by advanced civilizations, but massive kinetic cannons that looked like they could throw solid projectiles with enormous force. Missile launchers were visible in clusters along the hull, each one large enough to house warheads the size of Coalition fighters. Point defense systems covered every square meter of the ship's surface in overlapping fields of fire. The engine section was perhaps the most bizarre part of the entire design. Instead of the clean fusion torches or exotic matter drives used by Coalition ships, this vessel sported what appeared to be a collection of massive reaction drives that glowed with the angry orange light of barely controlled fusion reactions. The entire engine assembly looked like it had been designed by someone who believed that any problem could be solved by applying more thrust. "By the light," Admiral Zeftai whispered, using an old Nexari oath. "What is that thing?" "Sir," his communications officer announced, "we're receiving an identification signal. It's human." Of course it was. Zefti stared at humanity's interpretation of a warship and found himself both horrified and impressed. Every advanced species built their vessels with efficiency in mind, maximizing capability while minimizing resource expenditure. This ship represented the exact opposite philosophy. When in doubt, add more armor, more weapons, more engines, more everything. It should have been impossible for the thing to move, let alone fight. The power requirements alone should have melted the ship from within. The structural stress of those massive weapons should have torn the hull apart. The brute force approach to hyperspace travel should have scattered its atoms across several dimensions. But here it was, solid and real and somehow functional, despite violating every principle of sensible engineering. "Sir," Quilvin called out, his voice carrying new harmonics of amazement. "The human ship it's scanning the battlefield. But their sensors, sir, they're using active scans that would blind most Coalition sensors. They're flooding the entire area with radar, LiDAR, gravitational pulses and electromagnetic radiation across the entire spectrum. Aren't they worried about detection?" Zeftai asked. "Sir, I don't think stealth is part of their tactical doctrine. At all." Indeed, the human ship was announcing its presence to every sensor in the system. Where Coalition forces relied on passive, sensors, and elegant detection methods. The humans were using what could only be described as the sensor equivalent of shouting. They were broadcasting so much energy that they lit up on every detection system like a miniature star. But as Zeftai watched, he began to understand the method behind the apparent madness. The crude human sensors were getting detailed information about the swarm formation that Coalition passive sensors had missed. The active scanning was revealing weak points in enemy hulls, power distribution patterns, and internal structural details that could prove tactically valuable. Analysis of human vessel complete, his tactical officer announced. Sir, this ship it's an aberration. The armor is 3 times thicker than any Coalition vessel would require. The weapons are kinetic-based, which we abandoned as primitive millennia ago. The power plant appears to be multiple fusion reactors running in parallel, which is incredibly wasteful and dangerous. And the entire design prioritizes durability over every other consideration. Defensive capability? Zeftai asked. Sir, based on our analysis, this ship could probably survive a direct hit from a Nexari planet cracker and keep fighting. The armor distribution suggests they expect to take massive damage and continue operating. Zeftai felt his crystal structure brighten with a realization. Every Coalition ship was built with the assumption that avoiding damage was preferable to absorbing it. Their vessels were fast, maneuverable, and designed to destroy enemies at long range before they could respond. But what if you were facing an enemy that could adapt to your weapons? What if long-range precision became useless because the enemy learned to counter your attacks? Then maybe you wanted a ship that could take enormous punishment and get close enough to deliver attacks that couldn't be adapted to. Sir, his communications officer announced. Incoming transmission from the human vessel. Put it through, Zeftai ordered. The face that appeared on his command display was unmistakably human. The bilateral symmetry, the forward-facing eyes of a predator species, the expression of contained aggression that seemed to be a universal human trait. The woman wore a uniform that looked functional rather than decorative, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that surprised him. Coalition forces, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the human colonial navy ship Indomitable. We received your distress call and are here to assist. Zeftai found himself studying the human admiral's face. There was something in her eyes, a hardness that spoke of experience with violence, a confidence that suggested she had faced impossible odds before and somehow survived. Her species might be primitive by galactic standards, but this individual was clearly a seasoned military commander. Admiral Chen, I am Admiral Zeftai of the Nexari High Command. We appreciate your response, but I must inform you that the situation is beyond desperate. We face an enemy that adapts to our weapons and grows stronger from our attacks. Your single ship, however well-armed, cannot significantly impact a battle involving millions of vessels. Admiral Chen's expression didn't change. Understood, Admiral. What are the enemy's specific capabilities? Zeftai found himself explaining the tactical situation to a primitive human while simultaneously wondering why he was bothering. The swarm's adaptive biotechnology, their ability to learn from every attack, their seemingly unlimited numbers. How could he make a species that still used kinetic weapons understand the hopelessness of their situation? So they adapt to energy. Weapons, Admiral Chen said when he finished. What about kinetic attacks? Kinetic weapons have been obsolete for millennia, Zeftai replied. They're crude, inefficient, and limited in their effects compared to modern energy-based systems. For the first time since the conversation began, the human admiral smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator that had just spotted prey. Admiral, she said in a voice that carried undertones of barely restrained violence, you're about to learn why some problems require primitive solutions. And with that, the human ship did something that made every sensor operator in the Coalition fleet question their readings. It accelerated, directly toward the swarm formation, at a speed that should have been impossible for something so massive. Sir, Quilvin called out, his voice tight with disbelief. The human ship is accelerating at over 200 gravities. That level of acceleration should liquefy any crew aboard. Maybe their inertial compensation is more advanced than we thought, Zeftai suggested. Sir, I don't think they have inertial compensation. I think they're just enduring it. Zeftai stared at the tactical display as the human warship charged toward certain destruction with what could only be described as suicidal bravery. The ship was massively outnumbered, completely outgunned, and facing an enemy that had already proven capable of destroying the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, and the humans were attacking anyway. Sir, his tactical officer whispered, they're opening fire. What happened next would be analyzed by military historians for generations to come, assuming anyone survived to write military histories. The human ship erupted in violence that made the Coalition's elegant energy weapons look like gentle raindrops. Massive railguns launched tungsten projectiles at relativistic speeds, creating streaks of ionized particles as they tore through space. Missile clusters opened like deadly flowers, spitting out hundreds of warheads that accelerated toward the swarm formation with the inexorable persistence of natural law. And as the first kinetic round struck swarm bioships, something unprecedented happened. The enemy vessels simply exploded. No adaptation, no energy absorption, no clever biomechanical countermeasures, just physics. Pure, uncompromising, primitive physics applied with overwhelming force. By all the light in the galaxy, Admiral Zeftai whispered as he watched a single human ship accomplish what 2 million Coalition vessels had failed to do. They were hurting the swarm, and the galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the most primitive solution is also the most effective one. The first kinetic round struck a swarm bioship at 12% the speed of light. The tungsten penetrator, no larger than a human fist, carried more energy than most Coalition ships could generate in a full day. When it impacted the organic hull of the enemy vessel, the results were not elegant or sophisticated. There was no energy manipulation, no careful targeting of weak points, no precise application of force. There was simply physics. The bioship, a kilometer-long creature of living metal and alien flesh that had adapted to energy weapons, exotic matter disruptors and quantum interference, discovered that evolution had not prepared it for the fundamental laws of mass times velocity squared. The kinetic round passed through its adaptive hull like it was tissue paper, and the entire vessel detonated in an expanding cloud of superheated organic matter. Aboard the Coalition flagship, Admiral Zeftai watched his tactical display with the stunned silence of someone witnessing the impossible. Around him, his bridge crew stood frozen as the single human warship accomplished in seconds what their entire fleet had failed to do in hours. Confirmed kill on swarm vessel designated Alpha 77, his tactical officer announced in a voice that carried harmonics of disbelief. Cause of destruction appears to be simple kinetic impact. The enemy ship didn't adapt? Zeftai asked, though he already knew the answer. Sir, analysis suggests the swarm biotechnology can modify itself to resist energy-based attacks. But, his officer paused, consulting his readings. Sir, you can't adapt to momentum. The laws of physics don't negotiate. On the main tactical display, the human ship Indomitable continued its impossible charge into the heart of the swarm formation. More railgun rounds lanced out from its hull, each one finding its target with mechanical precision. Where sophisticated, Coalition targeting systems relied on energy signatures and quantum calculations, the human weapons used simple radar and optical tracking, crude by galactic standards but apparently effective enough. Sir, his communications officer called out. The human admiral is requesting tactical coordination. She wants targeting data on priority vessels. Zeftai found his voice. Send her everything, swarm command vessels, biocarriers, anything with strategic value. He paused, watching another enemy ship explode under kinetic bombardment. And ask her what assistance we can provide. The reply came back within moments in Admiral Chen's matter-of-fact tone. Stay clear of our firing solutions and try not to get in our way. We're just getting started. Just getting started. Zeftai looked at the tactical display, where the Indomitable had already destroyed more enemy vessels in 5 minutes than most Coalition ships managed in entire battles, and wondered what human warfare looked like when they were really trying. Was about to find out. The second phase of the human attack began when the Indomitable reached optimal missile range. Clusters of launch tubes along the ship's hull opened like mechanical flowers, and hundreds of warheads streaked out toward the swarm formation. But these were not the elegant guided munitions favored by coalition forces. Missiles that could adjust their course mid-flight and strike with surgical precision. These were something else entirely. "Sir," his tactical officer announced. Voice tight with amazement. "The human missiles they're nuclear weapons. Fusion warheads, each one with a yield equivalent to our tactical planet crackers." Zeftai felt his crystal structure dim with shock. Nuclear weapons had been abandoned by galactic civilization tens of thousands of years ago, as crude and indiscriminate. They were weapons of mass destruction, suitable only for destroying planets or asteroid fields. No civilized species would use them in ship-to-ship combat. Apparently, humans had different ideas about what constituted civilized warfare. The first nuclear warhead detonated in the middle of a swarm formation, creating a miniature star that burned for several seconds. Before fading, when the light cleared, a dozen bioships had simply ceased to exist, vaporized by temperatures that briefly matched the core of a sun. "The humans are using nuclear weapons in close formation combat," Zeftai said aloud, still not quite believing it. "That level of radiation should kill their own crew." "Sir," his science officer spoke up hesitantly, "scans of the human vessel suggest they have extensive radiation shielding. More than any reasonable design would require. It's as if they built their ship specifically to operate in high radiation environments." Of course they had. Zeftai was beginning to understand the philosophy behind human engineering. Where advanced species built elegant solutions to specific problems, humans seemed to prepare for every possible disaster simultaneously. Their ship was built to survive anything: energy weapons, kinetic impacts, radiation, boarding actions, probably even direct stellar collision. It was wasteful, inefficient, and completely insane. It was also working. On the tactical display, the Indomitable continued its charge toward the center of the swarm formation, leaving a trail of destroyed enemy vessels in its wake. Nuclear explosions lit up the darkness like a string of deadly pearls, each one eliminating enemy ships that had previously seemed invulnerable. But it was the third phase of the human attack that truly shattered every assumption about civilized warfare. "Sir," his tactical officer called out, voice cracking with disbelief, "the human ship it's not changing course. It's heading directly for that cluster of swarm dreadnoughts." Zeftai looked at the display and felt a chill run through his crystalline matrix. The Indomitable was indeed on a collision course with a formation of enemy capital ships, each one the size of a small moon and bristling with bioweapons. Any sane commander would alter course, use the ship's superior speed to maintain distance while continuing the bombardment. Admiral Chen was not altering course. "Are they planning to ram?" Zeftai whispered. The answer came moments later as the human ship struck the leading swarm dreadnought at a significant fraction of light speed. The impact was visible across the entire battlefield, a flash of light that outshone nearby stars as two massive objects converted their kinetic energy into pure destruction. Any normal ship would have been vaporized by such an impact. The Indomitable burst through the explosion, its hull scarred and burning but structurally intact, and continued toward the next enemy vessel. "Impossible," breathed his tactical officer. "No ship can survive that kind of impact." But apparently, human ships could. The Indomitable had used its own hull as a weapon, physically destroying an enemy dreadnought through the simple expedient of hitting it very hard, and somehow the human vessel's excessive armor and redundant systems had allowed it to survive the collision. "Sir," his communications officer announced. "Transmission from Admiral Chen. She says, 1 down, several million to go. We're just warming up." Warming up. Zeftai stared at the tactical display as the battered human ship continued its assault, using tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare, and wondered what his species had missed in their pursuit of elegant solutions. Perhaps sometimes the best answer to a sophisticated problem was to hit it with a very large stick, or in this case, a very large ship. The fourth phase of the human attack began when other swarm vessels moved to intercept the indomitable. Bioships swarmed around the human vessel like antibodies attacking an infection, firing weapons that had proven capable of destroying coalition dreadnoughts. The human response was immediate and characteristically direct. Point defense systems along the Indomitable's hull opened fire, filling space with a storm of kinetic projectiles. But these were not the precision weapons favored by galactic civilization. They were area denial systems designed to destroy anything within a certain radius. Thousands of small railguns fired constantly, creating a defensive barrier of hypervelocity metal that shredded anything that came too close. Swarm bioweapons struck the human ship's hull, weapons that had carved through coalition armor like it was paper. The Indomitable absorbed the attacks, its excessive shielding and redundant systems allowing it to continue fighting, despite damage that would have crippled any other vessel. "Sir," his engineering officer called out, consulting readings from their long-range sensors, "the human ship has taken damage that should have destroyed it 3 times over, but they keep fighting. How is that possible?" HFY was beginning to understand. Their ship isn't designed for elegance or efficiency. It's designed for one thing: to keep fighting no matter what happens to it. Indeed, the Indomitable was demonstrating the human approach to warfare. Not sophisticated tactics or advanced technology, but simple, brutal persistence. The ship absorbed damage that would have vaporized coalition vessels, then continued fighting. When weapons were destroyed, backup systems came online. When hull sections were breached, emergency barriers sealed the damage. When primary power failed, secondary reactors kicked in. It was redundancy carried to an almost ridiculous extreme, and it was keeping the human ship in the fight when any reasonable vessel would have been destroyed. "Sir," his tactical officer announced, voice filled with amazement, "the swarm ships they're pulling back from the human vessel." For the first time in the 3-year conflict, swarm forces were retreating from an enemy. The bioships that had swarmed the Indomitable were backing away, apparently unable to deal with an opponent that simply refused to be destroyed. But Admiral Chen was not content to let them escape. The Indomitable pursued the retreating swarm vessels, its engines blazing with fusion fire as it accelerated to speeds that should have been impossible for something so massive. More nuclear warheads streaked out from the human ship, each one eliminating enemy vessels that had previously seemed invincible. "Sir," his communications officer called out, "Admiral Chen is requesting targeting data on the swarm command vessel. She says she has something special planned for it." HFY looked at the tactical display, where the massive devourer sat at the center of the swarm formation like a dark hole in space. The thing had already proven immune to every weapon the coalition possessed. What could the humans possibly do against something that absorbed energy attacks and seemed to defy the laws of physics? "Send her the targeting data," he ordered, "and ask her what she needs from us." The reply came back immediately. "Just stay clear of the blast radius. This might get messy." Messy. HFY watched the human ship alter course toward the devourer and wondered what human commanders considered messy, if nuclear weapons and ramming attacks were considered normal tactics. He was about to find out. As the Indomitable approached the swarm command vessel, every sensor in the coalition fleet focused on the upcoming engagement. This was the moment that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Would human weapons prove effective against the enemy's most powerful vessel? Or would the devourer absorb the primitive kinetic attacks as easily as it had absorbed everything else? "Sir," his tactical officer announced quietly, "the human ship is charging its main weapon. Power readings are... Sir, they're off the charts. Whatever they're planning to fire requires more energy than our entire fleet generates." HFY felt his crystal structure brighten with sudden understanding. The humans hadn't just brought kinetic weapons to the battle, they had brought the biggest kinetic weapon anyone had ever conceived. And they were about to fire it at point-blank range. "All ships," he broadcast on the fleet-wide channel, "emergency withdrawal to minimum safe distance. The humans are about to teach us what primitive really means." As coalition forces pulled back to a safe distance, The Indomitable continued its approach toward the Devourer, two titans on a collision course that would determine the fate of every living thing in the galaxy. And for the first time since the war began, Admiral Zeftai found himself believing that victory might be possible, even if it required learning from a species that solved every problem by hitting it harder than anyone thought possible. The moment before Admiral Sarah Chen fired humanity's ultimate weapon, the galaxy held its breath. Every sensor in the Coalition fleet was focused on the Indomitable as it approached the Devourer, the swarm's command vessel that had proven immune to every attack the galaxy's most advanced civilizations could devise. The massive biomechanical monstrosity sat in space like a wound in reality itself, its dark hull absorbing light and hope in equal measure. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Zeftai watched the readings from his tactical displays with crystalline features bright with tension. The human ship had already accomplished the impossible, destroying swarm vessels that had adapted to every known weapon, using tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. But the Devourer was different. It was not just another enemy ship. It was the heart of the swarm, the intelligence that coordinated millions of biovessels across the galaxy. If the humans could destroy it. "Sir," his tactical officer announced, voice tight with anticipation. "The human vessel has reached optimal firing position. Distance to target, 15,000 kilometers. 15,000 kilometers. For energy weapons, that was practically point-blank range. But for kinetic weapons, it meant the target had virtually no time to react once the projectile was fired. Power readings from the human ship are still climbing," his sensor operator added. "Sir, they're channeling the output of their entire reactor array into a single weapon system." Zeftai felt a chill run through his crystal matrix. He had thought the humans were reckless before, but using their entire power grid to fire one shot was beyond reckless. It was suicidal. If the weapon failed to destroy the Devourer, the Indomitable would be defenseless, its power systems drained and its engines dead. What kind of weapon requires that much energy? He wondered aloud. His science officer consulted the sensor readings. "Sir, based on the power consumption and the mass readings we detected earlier, I believe they're accelerating a very large projectile to an extremely high velocity. The energy requirements suggest they're attempting to reach a significant fraction of light speed." A very large projectile at a significant fraction of light speed. Zeftai tried to imagine the kinetic energy involved and found the numbers almost incomprehensible. The weapon the humans were preparing to fire would carry more destructive force than most Coalition fleet actions. "Sir," his communications officer called out. "Transmission from Admiral Chen." The human face appeared on his display, and Zeftai was struck by the calm determination in her eyes. She looked like someone who had made peace with whatever was about to happen. "Admiral Zeftai," she said in her characteristically direct manner, "I want to thank you and your people for fighting as long as you did. What we're about to do, well, let's just say it's not something we do lightly." "Admiral Chen," Zeftai replied, "what exactly are you planning?" Chen's expression didn't change. "We're going to solve this problem the human way. Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one, even if it seems primitive to more advanced civilizations." Before Zeftai could ask what she meant, the transmission cut out. On his tactical display, the energy readings from the human ship spiked to levels that should have been impossible. "Sir," his tactical officer whispered, "they're firing." What emerged from the Indomitable's main weapon was not a missile or an energy beam. It was a solid projectile, a tungsten rod 50 meters long and 5 meters in diameter, accelerated to 25% the speed of light by magnetic fields that consumed every erg of power the human ship could generate. The projectile crossed the distance to the Devourer in less than a second. When it struck, the result was not an explosion in any conventional sense. It was the conversion of mass to energy, on a scale that briefly outshone the system's star. The tungsten rod, carrying kinetic energy equivalent to several large antimatter warheads, punched through the Devourer's reality-bending hull as if it were paper. The swarm command vessel, the nightmare that had consumed hundreds of star systems and proven immune to every weapon the galaxy possessed, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, a dark wound in space. The next moment there was only an expanding sphere of superheated plasma that had once been matter from both the projectile and its target. For several seconds, the battlefield was silent. Every ship in both fleets sat motionless, their crews trying to process what they had just witnessed. Then the remaining swarm vessels began to convulse. "Sir?" Zeftai's sensor operator called out, voice filled with amazement. "The swarm fleet is... They're losing coordination. The bioships are firing on each other, ramming into their own vessels. It's complete chaos." Without the devourer's guiding intelligence, the swarm's individual vessels reverted to basic biological imperatives. They turned on each other like animals. Their sophisticated coordination dissolved into primitive competition for resources. Ships that had moved in perfect formation now clawed at their neighbors, bioweapons firing indiscriminately into their own ranks. "The swarm fleet is destroying itself," Zeftai said in wonder. "The humans. They found the critical weakness. Remove the command structure, and the entire force collapses." On his display, the indomitable drifted powerless, its energy completely exhausted by the massive weapon discharge. But the human ship had accomplished what 2 million coalition vessels could not. It had ended the threat that had brought the galaxy to its knees. "Sir," his communications officer announced, "Admiral Chen is requesting assistance. Their power systems are completely drained and they need time to restart their reactors." "Dispatch rescue vessels immediately," Zeftai ordered. "Full honors escort for the ship that saved the galaxy." As coalition vessels moved to assist the powerless human ship, Zeftai found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about warfare, technology, and civilization itself. The humans had won not through superior technology or elegant tactics, but through sheer bloody-minded determination and a willingness to use solutions that more advanced species had dismissed as primitive. 3 hours later, Admiral Chen stood in the briefing room of Zeftai's flagship, surrounded by the Coalition's senior military leadership. Representatives from every major species in the galaxy were present, either in person or through holographic projection. The woman who had single-handedly turned the tide of an galactic war looked remarkably ordinary. Medium height, brown hair, wearing a uniform that was functional rather than decorative. But when she spoke, every being in the room listened with the attention due to someone who had just saved their civilization. "The swarm is finished as an organized threat," Chen reported matter-of-factly. "Without their command vessel, the remaining bioships have reverted to basic predatory behavior. They're eliminating each other faster than they ever eliminated us. Our analysis suggests the threat will be completely neutralized within 6 months." High luminal Velthar, his energy form still flickering from the damage his people had sustained, spoke first. "Admiral Chen, your species has accomplished what our combined civilizations could not. We owe you a debt that can never be repaid." Chen shook her head. "You don't owe us anything. You fought for 3 years against impossible odds. You sent out a distress call asking for help and we answered. That's what neighbors do. But your tactics," Queen Zakth clicked in her rapid insectoid language. "Your weapons, your strategies, they were so primitive, yet they were more effective than our most advanced systems. How is this possible?" Chen smiled, and for the first time since Zeftai had met her, it was a genuinely warm expression, rather than the predatory grin of a warrior. "Sometimes the most sophisticated problems require the most basic solutions. You tried to fight the swarm with elegant weapons and advanced tactics, but the swarm was designed to counter sophistication, to adapt to whatever you threw at them and become stronger." She gestured to the tactical display, where the remaining swarm vessels continued their self-destructive rampage. "But you can't adapt to physics, you can't evolve a defense against momentum, and you can't negotiate with a tungsten rod moving at a quarter light speed." "Your ship," Zeftai said, still struggling to understand. "It survived damage that should have destroyed it dozens of times over. How?" "Because we built it to get hit," Chen replied simply. "Our philosophy is different from yours. Where you build ships to avoid damage, we build them to absorb it and keep fighting. Where you rely on elegant solutions, we use redundancy and brute force. It's not as sophisticated, but sometimes sophistication is a weakness rather than a strength. Velthar's energy form pulsed with curiosity. But the resource expenditure must be enormous. The inefficiency of such designs is irrelevant when the alternative is extinction, Chen finished. We learned a long time ago that the most efficient solution isn't always the best solution. Sometimes you need something that works rather than something that's perfect. The briefing continued for several more hours, with coalition leaders asking detailed questions about human tactics, technology, and strategic philosophy. What emerged was a picture of a species that had developed along completely different lines from the rest of galactic civilization. Where most species had pursued elegance and efficiency, humans had focused on durability and redundancy. Where others had developed sophisticated solutions to complex problems, humans had maintained a preference for simple, robust approaches that could handle unexpected situations. It was a philosophy born from their home world, a planet where natural disasters were common, where survival required the ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, where the difference between life and death often came down to who could endure the most punishment and keep functioning. Admiral Chen, Zeftai said as the briefing drew to a close, what are humanity's intentions now? You've proven yourself capable of significant military action. Some species might be concerned about your expansion into the galaxy. Chen's expression grew serious. Admiral, we didn't come here to conquer anyone. We came because neighbors were in trouble and asked for help. That's all. We have no interest in ruling the galaxy or imposing our will on other species. She paused, looking around the room at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. But we do have one condition for our continued cooperation. The room fell silent. This was the moment many had been dreading, the demands of the victorious primitives. We want to be treated as equals, Chen said simply. Not as junior partners or primitive cousins who need guidance. We've proven we can handle ourselves in a crisis. We want a seat at the table when decisions are made that affect the galaxy. The request was so reasonable that several coalition leaders seemed surprised. They had expected demands for territory, resources, or tribute. Instead, the humans wanted only recognition and respect. Done, Zeftai said immediately. The coalition would be honored to welcome humanity as a full member species. The formal ceremonies would come later. Treaties would be signed, ambassadors exchanged, and humanity would take its place among the stars as an equal partner in galactic civilization. But the real change had already occurred in the minds of every being who had witnessed the battle. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the most primitive solution was also the most effective one. That sophistication could be a weakness as well as a strength. That there was value in approaches that prioritized function over form, durability over elegance, and results over efficiency. And perhaps most importantly, they had learned that when the darkness came calling, sometimes what you needed wasn't advanced technology or elegant tactics. Sometimes what you needed was humans. As Admiral Chen prepared to return to her ship, Zeftai found himself asking one final question. Admiral, there's something I must know. When you saw our distress call, when you learned about the swarm and the hopelessness of our situation, why did you come? Your single ship could not have hoped to make a meaningful difference against such overwhelming odds. Chen paused at the doorway and looked back at him. Her answer, when it came, was delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone she had used throughout their conversations. Because that's what humans do, she said simply. When someone asks for help, we help. When someone needs fighting, we fight. It doesn't matter if the odds are impossible or if we're completely outgunned. We show up anyway. She smiled one last time. The galaxy is a big, dangerous place, Admiral, but as long as humans are in it, nobody fights alone. As her shuttle departed for the indomitable, Zeftai stood at his viewport watching the rescue operations continue around the drifting swarm vessels. The war was over, the galaxy was saved, and a new chapter in galactic history was beginning. A chapter where the most important question wasn't how sophisticated your technology was, but whether you were willing to stand up when it mattered. The galaxy had found its guardians in the most unlikely place possible, and for the first time in 3 years, The stars shone a little brighter.